I will speak about some current trends in artificial intelligence and digital health for precision medicine. I'll probably give you a little bit of the history first, and then a bit of the industry perspective, and then say about what we do at Pharmatics, and also talk about a few trends in science and artificial intelligence with applications to health. So this is a very recent quote. "He who innovates will have for his enemies all those who are well off under the existing order of things, and only lukewarm supporters in those who might be better off under the new." This lukewarm temper arises partly from the fear of adversaries who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of mankind who will never admit the merit of anything new until they have seen it proved by the event. It's, in fact, Niccolo Machiavelli, 1532. And this quote pretty much reflects, I would say, what we can see in artificial intelligence and medicine. And pretty much everywhere, including innovation in medicine, is not necessarily the easiest way forward if you are an innovator. So let's see what we can learn from history about the developments in eHealth and remote patient monitoring as one important aspect of eHealth. In fact, in 1879, in The Lancet, which is a famous medical journal, there was the first ever description of the use of telephone to reduce unnecessary doctor visits. In fact, most of the space in this article was about the fear of telephone rather than anything else. So it was a new technology back then. But as soon as it appeared, just a few years after it, people started to think how to use it in healthcare. In 1920, a radio was used for providing clinical support on ships. In 1925, and actually I show a picture here from a journal, showed the doctor using a radio with some video capacity over here over the mirror, where a doctor was using a remote technology, or at least envisaged remote technology to diagnose the condition. Of course, this technology did not exist back then, but we can see that about 96 years ago, people thought about telehealth and using technology to provide healthcare. In 1948, radiological images were sent by telephone in a coded format from Pennsylvania to Philadelphia in the United States. And actually, television was used as a medical device, and as well as a phone. In 59 and 60s, there was a communication link between Nebraska Psychiatric Institute and Norfolk Medical Hospital. 1961, USSR and USA space program used tests on animals in space. So some kind of remote patient monitoring with patients being animals. In 73, telehealth was used to provide healthcare in rural areas in Arizona. So we do see that telehealth does have quite a long history. In 85 and 88, telehealth, remote patient monitoring, was used to provide healthcare in Mexico City and Soviet Armenia during earthquakes and after the aftermath of the earthquakes. 1993, the American Telemedicine Association formed. And then there was quite an extensive period of time, about 10 years, where we could see quite a lot of publications from academia about the use of remote patient monitoring until 2013. Discoveries from the UK, which showed that telehealth was not cost effective. So the main conclusion from very large scale multi-center clinical trials, which were the world's largest at the point, was that telehealth does not really seem to be a cost-effective addition to the usual care. It was attributed to false alerts. Basically, algorithms and various ways of acting on patient data which was collected remotely were set in such a way that clinicians were warned that something was wrong to a patient, because patient safety is paramount. And because of this, there are so many false alerts that nurses and clinicians taking part in those clinical trials needed to spend almost all of the time trying to investigate those false alerts. As a result, there was hardly any improvement in care and in clinical and patient outcomes, but at the same time, there was quite a substantial increase in the costs. In 2018, in December, in the UK, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which publishes clinical guidelines, concluded that there is no convincing evidence for the effectiveness of telehealth monitoring for reducing exacerbations. It was specifically for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but it's the major cause of emergency admissions in the UK and in many countries. And in many other conditions, the story was pretty much similar. Now, in 2019, despite the mixed findings from previous clinical trials, Germany has introduced what's known as a Digital Healthcare Act, allowing digital health solutions to be prescribed by doctors. So it was the first act of this kind. Previously, hospitals, individual providers, provider organizations, or individual payers or clinicians could pay for the digital technology, but for the first time, there was a clear guidance of how to prescribe digital apps by doctors. In 2020, we moved to a completely new world. We're still living in this world. In 2021, we can see that just 15 digital apps were prescribed by doctors for universal reimbursement in Germany. So somehow Germany did very well introducing this act before COVID struck. So that was a bit of history, but what's happening with the current trends and what's happening with the current clinical perspectives and perceptions of how artificial intelligence could be used currently and how artificial intelligence and digital health could be used in 5 or 10 years from now. This result is from McKinsey 2020. And we can see that at present, the majority of clinicians use artificial intelligence, if at all. They use it for diagnostics, then for clinical decision-making and data management. And in 5 or 10 years' time, at least the clinical perspective is that clinical decision-making will be the #1 use. Diagnostic will go down. In fact, the share of the market of diagnostic devices will be twice lower than it is now. And self-care and prevention, which is not even on the radar at the moment, or at least in 2020, will become the 3rd largest application. At least clinicians perceive that the greatest relative growth in applications of AI will be in self-management, prevention, and wellness, whereas clinical decision support will become the #1 of application for AI. Now, it's based on subjective interviews and perceptions of key opinion leaders and all this. Whether or not this is going to materialize, we're going to see. This slide shows the current investment trends in the post-COVID, in the pre-COVID world. So from 2010 until the end of 2019, just before COVID, in 10 years, 50 best funded health AI companies raised about $8.5 billion US in venture capital funding. And if you look at this, if you look at the space, if you look at the companies over here, we can see that, it's almost like the winner takes all. It's the exponential distribution. There is this Chinese company which handles health records, and it raised over 1 billion. And there is Babylon Health, the UK company, which is in fact almost a healthcare provider with some elements of artificial intelligence. Then there is a company doing agriculture. So it does do food supplements, but there are wellness and healthcare applications, but most of the revenues are generated elsewhere. Then when we go down this list, we see a lot of AI therapeutics and drug discovery companies. But overall, despite this wonderful amount of funding in pre-COVID world, the average investment, the average was below 1 million euros. So most startups and most kind of unicorns in the space, a unicorn is a company which is worth over $1 billion, generated revenues outside the specific health AI field. but it's interesting to look at this distribution pre-COVID. And we can see that 58% of the funding went to the top 10 companies. Now, what are the current trends post-COVID? And I'm still speaking about investment, because when we investigate how investors and funders spend their money, we can perhaps perceive which areas of artificial intelligence in health are going to grow, and what are the likely trends in this space. So what we can see was that there was actually, before COVID, the numbers were not that impressive, at least compared with 2019 Q3. But in the last 3 quarters, including the first quarter of this year, there has been a stable investment in health AI technologies globally. Now, what we can also see in this industrial space is that most funding goes mostly through so-called mega rounds, where a small number of relatively big companies get most of the funding, whereas many startup companies have to compete in an increasingly crowded space. So every time when you think you have a unique idea, we can sometimes see dozens of companies with the same unique idea implemented maybe only slightly differently. So because the space is getting so crowded, when you're developing an AI model, either as a student who has a brilliant startup idea, or an academic maybe thinking about translation, or a startup company or an industry, it's quite useful to see what's happening in this space. This space does get crowded. So also in this post-COVID world, current investment trends, just in the first quarter of this year, you can see that most funding has gone to drug discovery and supported self-management. Drug discovery is highlighted here in blue. For example, in vitro, raising the substantial amount of funding, 400 million in March 2021, a couple months ago, is doing machine learning to accelerate research and development and drug discovery. And similarly, Valo is doing machine learning in molecule and structural molecular biology to discover new drugs. So a lot of funding is going basically in the direction of drug discovery. And we also see some self-management, and perhaps COVID-19 was one of the key drivers for this. When patients cannot really go to hospitals, they need to somehow get support remotely. They need to self-manage remotely. What can we do, and what can we do also by using AI to help out those patients? So we expect quite a lot of growth, both in drug discovery and supported self-management, because this is what companies and funders are actively investing in. If you look at big technology companies, now Facebook and Apple and Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they make quite a lot of money in different kinds of markets, but they're starting to actually approach healthcare. And there are very interesting developments in some of these companies. Facebook and Apple are probably slightly more on the research and development side without necessarily having impressive products announced just yet. Specifically in the medical AI space, but Google and Microsoft are actually doing quite well. Google is investing very heavily in developing pharmaceuticals, various biopharmaceutical investment and life science investment. And Google, of course, is one of the leaders in artificial intelligence at the moment. So it's very interesting to see these developments. Maybe Google will eventually become, a vehicle behind medications. And certainly AlphaFold, the algorithm using artificial intelligence to model protein structures, announced and developed last year by DeepMind, a sister company of Google, or a part of Google. It's a very strong development in this space. Microsoft is doing some very interesting things also in genetics, and also basically accelerates data acquisition and data integration. This data integration thing is perhaps slightly less, uses slightly less of artificial intelligence, but certainly investment in genetics and artificial intelligence probably shows that Microsoft is perhaps going in the direction of pharmaceuticals as well. So what about the adoption trends? We have looked at the history. We have looked at what's being invested in. From this, we can actually perhaps predict what's going to grow in the next few years. But what about the current state of the game? How much AI is actually used in clinical practice? So what we can see is that despite the growing investment, practical adoption of artificial intelligence in health has been very limited. And this plot is from McKinsey 2019. It shows that maybe only about 0.7% of all publications in digital health appear in peer-reviewed journals. And also show verifiable data so that people can go and try to reproduce or maybe reproduce the algorithms and so forth. And out of this, maybe only 8 to 11% of the papers are highly cited. So we really speak about quite a lot of, I shouldn't really say noise, but quite a lot of publications, quite a lot of news stories and so forth, quite a lot of mentioning of AI in healthcare. Yet when it comes to verifiable results in peer-reviewed journals, we speak only about, a handful. Now, it also turns out that even big technology companies and unicorn companies, companies which are worth over $1 billion, struggle to implement artificial intelligence in healthcare. And in fact, fewer than 15% of those big powerful, rich companies have managed to take health AI to clinical practice beyond the single local setting. So sometimes a company, I don't know, a company like Google had a pilot, for example, in kidney failure or in kidney injury, rather, which was implemented in clinical practice at a single location. But it's not scalable. Currently, we can see that most of the developments are still at the levels which are perhaps way below profitability. So perhaps we could look at the current trends as an infrastructural investment. Maybe in a few years' time, we will see a lot more AI in health implemented and used in clinical practice. So what could be the stumbling blocks to this? What could be the bottlenecks? Why can we see so much invested in artificial intelligence in health and relatively little used in clinical practice to help the patients? Outside publications which appear every week and in hundreds potentially outside the impressive results, why do we see so little translation to clinical practice at the moment? Well, I guess we should try to understand this four-step procedure of what it takes to bring medical AI to clinical practice. First, it's research and development. Even if you manage to develop a highly accurate, well-performing and generalizable piece of medical AI, it's still very far from clear how to convert those results and predictions into safe, efficient, cost-effective, timely, and generalizable interventions. So we can predict, for example, that someone is going to die in 5 days with high probability, and AI can predict it accurately. Now, is it sufficient for us to know how to prevent this? What we should do now to prevent this bad outcome from happening? So it's not very clear. And there is quite a bit to go in terms of research and development to be able to convert results from an academic publication to something which can have a clinical value. Now, step number 2 is regulation. It involves following ISO certifications and other CE marking in Europe, FDA 510K in the USA to demonstrate safety. So even if you developed models, your algorithms are robust, you have demonstrated that it may have clinical value, it's still quite important to be able to build services around your models which are safe for real-world use. Now, what happens if patients don't supply the data? What happens if you develop a piece of AI which uses Zoom, which crashed for the first, 5 minutes of my presentation today? Will patients still be safe if you're providing point of care, services by using artificial intelligence by Zoom, for instance? So all these questions are taking models and demonstrating that these models, AI models, result in safe services built around them in the real world setting. I think it's another step which is quite often missing and which is the second stumbling block. The next step is actually a demonstration of efficacy and cost effectiveness. Even if we performed clinical validations, rather demonstrated safety, we still need to perform clinical validations in prospective clinical trials or other kinds of prospective studies, not necessarily double-blind trials. Even if your products and services built around artificial intelligence models are safe, they may be of no practical use. So it's a safe product, but it just doesn't really generate any added value. For example, it might be too expensive, or pretty much like we saw from those historical examples, it doesn't add value on top of the standards of care. Maybe it just wastes clinicians' time, who now need to supervise AI models rather than doing something useful with those AI predictions. Or maybe we can make accurate predictions. All those results are safe, but we just cannot really prevent bad outcomes from happening. To be able to demonstrate value, we need clinical trials, and this is a very long and expensive undertaking. Now, finally, the reimbursement bit. Even if you have a product or a service which is effective, stakeholders may still not be interested. So you have gone through AI development, you've gone through regulations, you've spent a lot of time and money to go through clinical trials. It seems to be a useful piece of technology, which is very useful if patients follow this, but patients just don't like it, or clinicians don't like it for whatever reason. So getting reimbursement, getting actually someone to use it and to pay for it is another big question. And in fact, going all the way through reimbursement is happening only for a tiny fraction, tiny fraction of all AI developments in health, which we can see nowadays. So what could be the underlying reason for it? Perhaps we need to try to understand the need of multiple stakeholders in healthcare and in artificial intelligence for healthcare. Okay, there are providers, healthcare providers, hospitals or clinicians. They want to spend less time and money to provide high quality healthcare. They also want to increase market share by reducing false positives. For example, in the United States, hospitals need to compete for patients reducing false negatives when they don't want to end up in a situation when they somehow miss a diagnosis of cancer, because then they would lose the patient and the patient can sue those hospitals. Providers really care about those false negative results, which is perhaps a little bit opposite from payers, such as insurers and employers. Insurance companies want to avoid unnecessary costs by reducing I apologize for this typo, by reducing false positives in this case. So insurers don't really want to pay for an intervention which is a false positive. If someone has cancer, or AI model says that that someone has cancer, but it's a false positive, a person doesn't really have cancer, a person doesn't need those expensive medications, insurers don't want to spend money on this. And patients probably don't want this either, because those medications have severe side effects. Patients, they want to stay healthy as long as possible with least effort and for free. Certainly in Europe, patients expect relatively free healthcare and relatively low out-of-pocket costs for healthcare. Vendors want to develop as quickly as possible with as little regulation as possible, and they want to increase and retain the market share. So based on whom you're speaking about, based on how you want your technology to be used, are you developing a product, for example, for the government, which may be the major health payer, like a state insurance, a state health insurance? Then you probably need to think how to reduce the false positives. If you're developing a product for patients, you want to make it engaging and as cost efficient as possible for the patients, and also ideally free for the patients. So I'll tell you now very quickly about a few things we are doing at Pharmatics. Now, based on the discussion of trends, we have 3 products in each of the major areas. One of the products is called MedAI, which aims to support clinical decisions. And we've seen that clinical decision support is a major application of medical AI. So this piece of software, AI-powered software, supports evidence-based medicine. In fact, it combines data-driven and evidence-based medicine for predictions and clinical care. We've got a product which is called MyCare, which is AI-powered support of self-management, AI-powered supported self-management of respiratory conditions. And in the drug discovery space, we're building what we call MindMap, which combines artificial intelligence and brains on a chip for drug screening in Alzheimer's disease. And these are at various stage of being on the market or being prototyped. Basically, this product number 3 is a prototype with some strong internal results and partnerships with pharmaceutical companies. So this MedAI product, AI for evidence-based medicine. Now, customers are healthcare providers with a budget for developing and implementing innovative 21st century medicine. We have worked with NHS in Lothian, which is Edinburgh, Edinburgh and suburbs. They serve, I think, 850,000 people around Edinburgh in Scotland. And with Mayo Clinic, we are in discussions. We haven't really worked with them directly, but we have worked with companies who work with Mayo Clinic. Basically, the other commercialization here and the use for this clinical decision support are digital health and consumer health vendors interested in expanding their offerings and getting to next funding rounds. So what's the problem? Many companies are looking at this artificial intelligence space, and they're interested to be ahead of the competition in AI, in medicine. But producing unbiased and reliable and explainable AIs that people can trust is not very easy. It's even less straightforward to develop artificial intelligence for small data sets. And actually, as a part of this workshop today, you would be asked to think about applications in COVID. And certainly when we started looking at COVID, the data sets which we had available for COVID-19 were quite small. So many companies struggled to develop AI solutions for COVID-19. So we have developed a service which converts medical knowledge to predictive software. We combine real-world data with published evidence, and basically our AI software mines millions of publications, identifies which publications could be relevant to a given condition and outcome, evaluate quality of those publications, retrieve information, and at the end produce predictive software. So not only we produce, extracts of scientific articles, we actually build a predictive model on the basis of statistical results, which we can see in peer-reviewed publications in the medical space. This helps to use millions of person years of relevant medical research as a starting point for AI construction. So when we then build artificial intelligence models, we don't start building those models from scratch using a relatively small data set which can be available to us, but rather we use the best of the cutting-edge knowledge which we could extract and formalize from publications as a starting point. And we have demonstrated that this leads to robust AI solutions, even for relatively small data sets, also for rare conditions, or rare populations, which could be underrepresented in our data sets. So this has resulted in a rapid development and adoption of patient-facing guidance in COVID and respiratory illness in NHS Lothian. So I think about 18,000 patients can benefit from this around Edinburgh. Also, we're supporting multiple UK-wide developments in AI-powered medical software. Companies may develop products in diabetes, may be interested in building AI. They may not necessarily have a big data set to build AI. We go and mine what has been done in diabetes predictions, for example, reducing mortality in diabetes. We construct predictive models based on publications, and those models are used as a starting point for developing new AI using a relatively small data set. And there are international developments in California, in the state of Washington, in AI-enriched remote patient monitoring. There are multiple competitors in this space. Many companies, IBM and Microsoft, they look at getting insights from medical publications, producing various plots, or producing a short summary of an academic article. we are not only doing this, but we also generate predictions from medical publications. And the closest competitors are based on Stanford and also MSD, the sister company of Merck, a big pharmaceutical company. And there are other companies which do something similar in the preclinical space, kind of a drug discovery space. But with our MedAI product, we basically look at clinical decision support, clinical predictions. Our next product is what we call MyCare, artificial intelligence for self-management of chronic respiratory illness. So we work with providers who are interested in improving effectiveness and uptake of respiratory self-management, and also pharmaceutical companies interested to monitor respiratory clinical trials. So the problem is that care for long-term conditions must shift away from the hospital towards the patient, because our population is aging. Our clinicians are overwhelmed with unstoppable challenges like COVID-19. 95% of care for long-term conditions needs to be done or is being done by patients and family members already. So we are trying to make it easier, because patients find it difficult to self-manage without clinical support, and clinically supported self-management is limited and expensive. We have developed AI which helps with this. I'll skip through some slides. Basically, it looks quite simple because many people with condition are actually the elderly. They need pretty simple interfaces. People are invited to submit vitals, biomarker data, questionnaire data. They get predictions for what's going to happen today, what's going to happen tomorrow. In fact, we can generate health predictions for 7 days in advance. People can also get support of how to use inhalers. And we've shown some impressive improvements over Google AI in, for example, detecting palms in images, palms which may hold, or wrists, hands which hold inhaler devices. And pretty much in real time, we can then track the inhaler technique and produce guidance for the patients of whether they use inhalers correctly or incorrectly. And it's on top of producing personalized health forecasts. So again, for any idea which you have, you think it's a new idea, unique idea, you can probably find about 20 customers in this, or 20 vendors, 20 developers who already have products in the market. Not and probably for 20 companies, you can probably find 200 academic groups which are active in this space. And we are also different in this space in comparison with other companies, because we use artificial intelligence for a patient-facing application, in contrast to clinician-facing applications, where most artificial intelligence in this specific space has been used for. And finally, our last product or service, which is still under development, is a service for pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations interested in improving drug discovery and development for Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is a very difficult condition. Generally, we can say that costs of drug discovery and development are very high. To get a new drug to the market may cost you $2 billion capitalized, and those costs are actually increasing. And there are multiple limitations of using cell lines and animals when screening drugs for brain disorders. Usually when you have a good drug candidate, you first test this drug in mice, and you check whether or not this drug is working in mice, for example, and then you hope it would work for the humans. But because the mouse brain is so difficult from the human brain, for most mice and for most humans, I should say, this animal screening of new drugs doesn't really work. Animals are too different from humans. So as a result of this, there are hardly any successful drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So in collaboration with a Belgian company and a Dutch company who specialize in organoids and in Alzheimer's disease, we have developed a service which grows neuronal networks, which grows those tiny human brains on a piece of silicon. So first we extract stem cells, we grow those stem cells into not neural networks, which is an AI concept, but neuronal networks, basically a tiny brain living in a chip. And we wash those tiny, communities of cells with various drugs, collect a lot of data from those brain-on-chip devices, and from the collected videos, we make predictions of what's going to happen to an Alzheimer's drug. Do we have an indication that the drug is likely to work in a human or not, based on the existing evidence in this space? So basically, candidate medications are applied to organoid devices, brain-on-chip devices. We've got terabytes of videos of how, networks of brain cells grow in time. And on this basis, we make predictions of what's going to happen in a human. So it's actually going through internal testing with some very promising initial results. So we hope it can actually help us solve Alzheimer's eventually. In the last few moments, I'll just go very quickly through AI trends in this space. Some of those slides, were in the bonus section of slides in the course, but I'll just show you a few trends which are not frequently mentioned. And one area of artificial intelligence developments, which we see could be quite important in medical AI, is the so-called adversarial robustness. So it's a famous article from 2014 from Google, and Ian Goodfellow is the guy behind generative adversarial networks, who was the co-author in this paper as well. Basically, what's shown is that you can take an original image of a bus or a dog, you can add a tiny noise, visually imperceivable noise to those images. In fact, this noise has been amplified tenfold, and suddenly your AI models, state-of-the-art AI models, convolutional neural networks and so forth, could classify your images not as a bus and not as a dog, but as an ostrich in this case. And there are reasons for why this happens. Basically, when we deal with relatively high dimensional problems, even our W could be the weight of our inputs, and X could be our inputs, our points, which get weighted together when we build AI models. When we add even a tiny amount of noise to our inputs, if our inputs are high dimensional, like images are quite frequently high dimensional, it's in fact possible to add the noise in such a manner that AI is completely broken. We can say that AI can be forced to output any label, any output we like. And in health space, it's quite dangerous. We can take the original image of a benign mole. We can add some noise which doesn't really look like anything. In fact, it's 0.04 times by this, so it's amplified quite considerably. And suddenly, the state-of-the-art AI model developed, I think, in MIT, which was performing better than human clinicians, dermatologists. It could start to output malignant tumor. So the image looks nearly identical, but AI is completely broken. And this has major basically possible adverse effects in healthcare. For example, a health insurer who wants to confirm or refute a medical diagnosis, an insurer who doesn't want to pay for expensive treatment, could add the noise, which is visually imperceptible, and say, oh, look, it's, for example, not a cancer, it's a benign image, and vice versa. And similarly, a pharmaceutical company or another company, digital health company, a vendor of any kind, going through the regulators may perturb the images. And if a regulator uses images to somehow say whether AI is going to work or not, by adding imperceptible noise, we can say that, yes, the drug is effective, the tumor has shrunk as a result of using a new medication, for example. So this is a major problem, and ensuring that we can build robust AI under those small perturbations of data is actually quite important. I will probably not go through the details of how to address this question. I'll only say that most AI models are about optimizing some kind of an objective function. For example, an error function where inputs X are mapped to outputs Y. And basically, we can try to address the adversarial robustness questions by redefining our objective function. Say that in addition to minimizing some error, we'll be minimizing another error with potentially some other coefficient, which will now be trained on perturbed images or perturbed samples. Eta here is the perturbation which is made. And there are kind of other state-of-the-art approaches to solving this. We still, for example, try to minimize an error, but we want to make sure that predictions made on clear image and perturbed image are as close to each other as possible. So we penalize distances on the predictions produced by two kinds of models. So it's a very actively researched area, and it's fundamental to be able to address this if you want to see medical AI being implemented in clinical practice, and if you want clinicians to trust us and not really end up in a situation like this where we have a complete change in the label due to imperceptible perturbations. Another important aspect is transfer learning. Now, most of artificial intelligence assumes that source tasks S and target tasks T are somewhat similar. So our distribution of the patients and a data set which we use to train our AI model is similar to the target data set where the model is going to be used. But it's very rarely the case in a medical space. For example, it's not very easy to get children in pediatric clinical trials, for example. So we may develop an AI model in an adult population, which may not necessarily work for the children. Our target task would be the children. The source task would be training an AI model for an adult population. And it's not necessarily the case that the distributions and samples which we have from those distributions are similar. It's not necessarily the case that AI is going to generalize. So what do we do about this? Just to give you an illustration of this, it's in transfer learning, actually. It's important to understand that in classic AI, we typically deal with big data sets and strong prior knowledge. For example, AI can be very accurate when we deal with cats and dogs classification. For example, we can go to Google Images, look for the cats, get 100 million images of cats. Even if some of those images are noisy or incorrectly labeled, we can still train an artificial intelligence model to get an accurate prediction of cats, adult cats or kind of kittens. It doesn't really matter. The choice, the transference of distributions doesn't really matter very much if our data sets are huge. But in the medical space, we quite often deal with small data and relatively weak prior knowledge. Unless we are experts in dermatology, for example, we don't really know if it is cancer or no cancer. So one idea also in this transfer learning, using distributions from a source task, which is different from the target task, is to pre-train a model on an auxiliary task, for example, on cats and dogs classification, and apply such models to medical imaging and medical classifications in the medical space. So source tasks may be very different from the target tasks, but we can still use the data and we can still use solutions and AI models, this AI model 1 as a starting point for AI model 2. Basically in our mind map product, we are doing something similar where, for example, we have those terabytes of videos of neuronal cells, and it turns out that detection of specific cells turns out to be a simpler auxiliary task to solve, which helps us to solve the target task of classification of the response to Alzheimer's drugs, positive or negative. It's probably the most important equation. I know it's very heavy, but one of the most important equations you will probably ever see in medical applications of artificial intelligence, a fundamental result from 15 years ago, which says that basically, if you want to achieve a good performance in the target domain, this is a target domain for the target task, you need to achieve a good performance in the source task, and also try to find your source task, which is as close to the target task as possible. So basically, if you never mind all this mathematics, it actually says something very simple. If you're facing a very challenging target task in medical AI, which you're trying to solve, you may try to solve a simpler source task, but then basically somehow try to also minimize the distance between the source task and the target task which you're solving. Now, the final point, which I'll mention about where AI is going, is causality. Now, what this plot shows is mortality by country, and it's data by World Factbook in 2009. And there is something very surprising about this plot. You can probably see that mortality per 1,000 people is quite high in Africa. Maybe it's not very surprising, but there are some funny and counterintuitive observations which we can see here. And the observation, if you look at this, you can see, for example, that Mexico here and the United States, Mexico has 5 people dying per 1,000 people, whereas USA has 8 people dying per 1,000. When we compare, you cannot really see it, but when we compare Nigeria with Latvia, in fact, Nigeria has better mortality rates than Latvia for whatever reason. Now, this seems counterintuitive if you assume that the country and GDP per capita results in a causal relationship on crude mortality rates. So if you assume that this model from GDP to mortality is causal, we would say that, oh no, it cannot be right. Something funny is happening over here. But basically, if you now take the age into the equation, we can see that the number of people in Mexico who are over 65 in 2013 was only 6%, whereas 14% of such people in the USA. The number of people with the age of over 65 in Nigeria was 3%, whereas in Latvia it was 19%. And actually, the aging in the developed countries is increasing. The proportion of the elderly population is increasing. So perhaps the causal relationship should be somewhat different. The country GDP may result in an increase in the average age in the society, and then the age and the GDP may have some effect on crude mortality. There are formal AI ways to explore causality and the existence of confounders. For example, this book by Bernard Shelkoff, you can find it online if you're interested. So my final slide on this is about AI in AI and healthcare. So we could say that AI in healthcare is probably still in the infancy or in the childhood. There are many challenges, such as varying constraints and varying objectives, because due to this highly regulated space and multiple stakeholders who have completely different targets. There are some unique challenges about patients' health being very important, about concerns for privacy and ethics and regulation and all this. But it may be the most exciting time ever to be in the medical AI space. Which concludes this presentation. And despite Zoom problems, we've made it successfully until the end. Thank you.